Okay, so a stadium somewhere in the world just spent a decade preparing for one single afternoon. 80,000 seats, a trophy lifted in front of a television audience, measured not in millions, but in billions, and a host city that just spent years telling its citizens this would change everything. Here is what the confetti falling on the pitch does not show you. A construction bill that started in the billions before a single ticket was sold. A governing body that keeps almost all of the real money and leaves the host holding almost all of the real risk. And a piece of economic sleight of hand so consistent across decades of these tournaments that economists have practically stopped arguing about it and started simply documenting it as a pattern that repeats every single time. Before we talk about the day of the final itself, we need to talk about who actually captures the revenue from a World Cup, because it is almost never the host country, and this single fact reorganizes everything else in this story. FIFA, the international body that owns and organizes the tournament, retains the overwhelming majority of the commercial revenue generated by the event, broadcast rights sold to networks around the world. Global sponsorship deals with the handful of brands willing to pay enormous sums for official partner status, and licensing revenue tied to the tournament's name and imagery. Recent editions of the tournament have generated total revenue for the governing body well into the billions of dollars, the bulk of it arriving through broadcast contracts negotiated years in advance with networks across virtually every country on Earth. Precisely the same dynamic we have seen with every major sporting property: live, unskippable global attention, commanding a premium that no other form of media can replicate at this scale. The host country and host cities, by contrast, generally do not receive a share of that central revenue pool in any meaningful way. What they receive instead is the right and the enormous financial obligation to build or renovate the stadiums, the transportation infrastructure, the security apparatus, and the hospitality capacity required to actually stage the tournament. This is the central asymmetry sitting underneath the entire business model. The organization that owns the intellectual property and sells the broadcast rights keeps the overwhelming majority of the profit. The city and country that build the physical infrastructure and absorb the operational risk are left, in most cases, to recoup their investment indirectly, if they recoup it at all, through tourism, and through a category of intangible benefit that turns out to be far murkier than any economic development report promised in advance. Let's talk about what actually gets built, because the construction bill for hosting a tournament of this scale dwarfs almost every other category of sporting infrastructure spending on Earth. A single World Cup stadium built to the specifications required: minimum seating capacity, broadcast infrastructure, security perimeter, and often a retractable roof or climate control system, given that matches now get played across a wide range of climates and seasons, commonly costs several $100 million to well over $1 billion for a single venue. And a modern World Cup does not require one stadium. It requires a dozen or more spread across multiple host cities, alongside the surrounding infrastructure, expanded airports, new rail and transit lines, hotel capacity built or renovated to accommodate a sudden multi-week surge of international visitors, and security infrastructure designed to protect gatherings measured in the tens of thousands at every single match across the tournament's run. Recent tournaments have carried total infrastructure price tags ranging from several $billion on the more modest end to figures reported well beyond $100 billion for the most ambitious host nations, depending heavily on how much existing stadium and transit infrastructure a country already had in place before winning the bid versus how much had to be built entirely from scratch. This is the first and largest lesson in World Cup economics, and it explains almost every controversy that follows a hosting announcement. The bid process itself creates enormous pressure for candidate nations to promise transformative infrastructure investment, specifically because that ambition is part of what wins the vote, which means the countries most likely to win a hosting bid are often precisely the countries facing the largest total construction bill relative to what they already had. Now, Here is where the officially promised economic case for hosting begins to run into a wall of independent academic research that has, with remarkable consistency across decades of these tournaments, reached the same uncomfortable conclusion. Economists who study major sporting events largely independent from the tournament, organizers themselves have repeatedly found that the actual economic impact of hosting falls dramatically short of the figures presented during the bidding process, and in some studied cases produces close to no measurable net economic benefit at all once the full construction and operating costs are weighed against the tourism and business activity actually generated. The mechanism behind this gap is one we have seen before on this channel in the context of stadium financing. Generally, money spent by visitors attending matches is very often money that would have been spent somewhere else in the local economy anyway, on a different vacation, a different form of entertainment, a different weekend activity, meaning the net new economic activity created is frequently far smaller than the gross spending figures that get cited in promotional economic impact studies commissioned by hosting committees themselves, studies which face an obvious incentive structure to produce optimistic projections. There is also a category of cost that rarely makes it into the promotional material at all: the ongoing maintenance burden of stadiums built specifically for a tournament that leaves town after roughly a month and never returns. A venue constructed to seat 80,000 people specifically for World Cup capacity requirements frequently has no realistic domestic sporting tenant capable of filling anywhere close to that capacity on a regular basis once the tournament ends. Several previous host nations have documented cases of tournament stadiums sitting largely dormant or converted at additional expense to smaller scale uses in the years following the event, while continuing to require security, maintenance, and debt service payments on construction financing that was justified in the original planning documents primarily by a single month of intense international attention. So where does the actual money flow during the tournament itself, and who captures it? Ticket sales, while a meaningful revenue category, are actually one of the smaller pieces of the overall financial picture relative to broadcast and sponsorship revenue, precisely because stadium capacity, even across dozens of matches in a large venue, caps how much total ticket revenue a single tournament can generate compared to the essentially unlimited scale of a global broadcast audience. Official sponsorship, sold at the very top tier directly by the governing body to a small handful of multinational brands willing to pay enormous sums for global association with the tournament, represents one of the largest and most profitable revenue categories, and virtually none of that sponsorship revenue flows to the host city or host country directly. It flows to the central organizing body that sold the rights in the first place. Hospitality and tourism spending during the tournament window represents the category host cities actually do capture directly. Hotels, restaurants, transportation, retail spending from the influx of international visitors attending matches. And this is genuinely significant in absolute terms, frequently running into the hundreds of millions or low billions of dollars in direct visitor spending across a full tournament hosted across multiple cities. The unresolved question, and the one independent economists keep returning to, is not whether this spending happens, it clearly does, but whether it represents genuinely new economic activity for the host economy, or simply a redirection of tourism and spending that would have flowed somewhere else in the local economy regardless, along with whether it comes anywhere close to justifying the infrastructure bill that made hosting possible in the first place. Let's build the two honest scenarios, because host nations have produced examples of both across the tournament's long history. The favorable outcome. A host country enters the bidding process already possessing much of the required stadium and transit infrastructure from hosting other major events or maintaining a robust domestic sporting culture, meaning the incremental construction spending required is comparatively modest relative to countries building from a much lower baseline. Existing venues get renovated rather than built from scratch, Transit infrastructure investment accelerates projects the country needed regardless of the tournament. And the stadiums have realistic post-tournament tenants, professional domestic league teams capable of filling a meaningful share of the seating capacity for decades after the trophy gets handed out. In this scenario, hosting functions similarly to how the strongest performing sports franchises and stadium districts we have examined on this channel operate. The marquee event serves as an accelerant for infrastructure and development the host was likely to need anyway, rather than as the sole justification for building it. And the long-term asset, transit, venues, global visibility, retains genuine value well beyond the tournament month itself. The unfavorable outcome. A host country wins the bid specifically because of an ambitious promise to build extensive new infrastructure, essentially from scratch, financing construction primarily through public debt, with limited existing venue capacity to offset the total bill. Stadiums get built in cities without a robust domestic league or fan base capable of sustaining that seating capacity afterward. Construction costs run over initial projections, a documented pattern across a majority of major sporting events studied by independent economists, due to compressed timelines, specialized labor demands, and the political impossibility of missing a fixed, globally broadcast deadline that cannot be delayed the way an ordinary construction project might be. The tournament month itself generates genuine tourism revenue and a month of unmatched global visibility. But the debt service on stadium construction continues for decades afterward, frequently on venues drawing a small fraction of their intended capacity for the vast majority of the years following the event. The net result, documented across multiple previous host nations by researchers with no stake in the promotional narrative, is total public cost that meaningfully exceeds any reasonably measured economic benefit, a gap absorbed not by the tournament's organizing body, which has already collected its broadcast and sponsorship revenue and moved on to negotiating the next host bid, but by the taxpayers of the country that won what was, at the time, treated as a prize. So does hosting a World Cup final actually pay for itself as a piece of economics rather than a piece of national pride? The honest answer, built on decades of independent research rather than the promotional materials produced during any individual bidding campaign, is that it depends almost entirely on how much infrastructure a country already had before it ever raised its hand to host. A variable that has far more predictive power over the eventual financial outcome than anything that happens during the tournament itself. The organization selling the broadcast rights and collecting the sponsorship checks has built a business model that transfers almost all of the financial risk downstream to the host, while retaining almost all of the most reliable revenue upstream for itself. Structurally, the same asymmetry we have now seen repeat itself across ranches, malls, sports franchises, and broadcast rights deals throughout this entire channel. The entity that owns the scarce, protected asset captures the value, and the entity that builds the physical infrastructure underneath it absorbs the risk. The trophy gets lifted, the confetti falls, the broadcast cuts to commercial, and the stadium, all 80,000 seats of it, has to figure out what to do with itself for the next 4 years, until anyone even remembers it exists again.